Welcome to the Ruby on Rails tutorial, Learn Web Development with Rails. I'm Michael Hartl, author of the Ruby on Rails tutorial, and your host for these screencasts. The purpose of this tutorial is to teach you how to develop custom web applications. The resulting skill set will put you in a great position to get a job as a web developer, start a career as a freelancer, or found a company of your own. If you already know how to develop web applications, this tutorial will quickly get you up to speed with Ruby on Rails. The focus throughout this tutorial is on the general principles of web development. And so while of necessity we'll have to pick a particular framework, the skills you'll be learning are generally transferable to other frameworks as well. That being said, the particular framework we'll be using is especially well suited to our task, and is generally a great choice for making web applications, namely Ruby on Rails, often called Rails for short. Rails is used by a huge variety of different companies, including Airbnb, GitHub, Hulu, and Shopify, a hugely successful online store builder. In fact, the founding CEO of Shopify, Tobi Lütke, was one of the earliest members of the Rails core development team, and attributes a substantial amount of Shopify's success to the decision to use Rails. Rails is also especially good for this kind of tutorial because it's what's called a full-stack framework, covering everything from the back-end that talks to the database and persists user data and so on, all the way to the front end that renders HTML or hypertext markup language back to the user's browser. As a result of this integrated design, by learning Rails, you'll really understand how web apps work. Throughout this tutorial, we'll be developing 3 different web applications of increasing sophistication. Starting in this chapter with a simple Hello app. Then in chapter 2, we'll develop a toy app, which is a simplified but real database-backed web application. Then in chapters 3 through 14, we'll develop the main sample application for the Ruby on Rails tutorial, called Sample App. Now, the name Sample App is intentionally generic, because, as always, we'll be focusing on general principles. The sample application shows how to make the kinds of things you'll need for pretty much any kind of web application, such as a way for users to sign up or to log in. In addition to these generic elements, we'll also learn how to make a particular kind of web application, specifically a simplified version of Twitter, a web application that, coincidentally, was also originally built in Rails. There are no formal prerequisites for this tutorial, which covers all the things you need to know for Ruby on Rails web development, including the underlying Ruby programming language, the Unix command line, hypertext markup language or HTML, cascading style sheets or CSS, a small amount of JavaScript, and even a little SQL or structured query language. That is a lot of material though, so if you're completely new to software development, I recommend learning the prerequisites to this tutorial by starting with the tutorials at Learn Enough, especially Learn Enough command line to be dangerous and Learn Enough Ruby to be dangerous. You can find out more about those tutorials at learnenough.com. On the other hand, a surprising number of complete beginners have gotten through this tutorial, so don't let me stop you if you're excited to build web apps. Let's get started. Now it's time to get up and running with our Ruby on Rails development environment. This used to be really hard to set up, but the Rails tutorial has a long-running partnership with Cloud9, now part of Amazon Web Services, which lets us run a full development environment right in our browser, as seen here. A second option is to set up a native system as a development environment. In this case, I'm running Mac OS. Here's a terminal window. And here's a text editor. I definitely suggest setting up your native operating system as a development environment at some point, and you can find details in Learn Enough Dev Environment to be dangerous, but it's a lot more difficult. In order to get things to work, you're likely to have to apply your technical sophistication, which is a term we use at Learn Enough to refer to the general ability to figure out technical problems. But for now, if there's any question in your mind, I definitely recommend using this Cloud Integrated Development Environment, or Cloud IDE, to complete the Ruby on Rails tutorial. It's easy to use, powerful, and makes for a pleasant development experience. This is the Cloud IDE with the sample application as it appears at the end of the tutorial. Let's see how to get started. First of all, you'll have to sign up for an account at Amazon Web Services if you don't already have one. As of this recording, running Cloud9 is free for a year, and even after that, the cost is negligible, literally pennies per month. Of course, I already have an account, so I'll just sign in. And then you can type here, Cloud9, or you can see recently visited here. You might get this little warning that says root login detected. This is a good thing to take care of eventually, but it's not important at the level of this tutorial. So here, now I'm going to create an environment. You can see Rails Tutorial 6. This is what I used to complete the Rails tutorial when I went through it for the latest release. But now let's create a new environment just to show how to do it. So you can say Rails tutorial here. You can say a Cloud IDE for the Ruby on Rails tutorial, and then you click on Next Step. Now this is important. As of this recording, Amazon Linux doesn't work with Rails. So we need to switch to Ubuntu server like this. And now we're ready to create the environment. And there we go. It's a fully functional development environment in the cloud. Here we have a file system navigator on the left. There's a text editor here in the middle. And then at the bottom, there's a fully functional Linux command line terminal. And now there's one extra bit of configuration to do, which is to set the number of spaces that's used when indenting. As you can see here, the default is 4. But the near universal convention in Ruby is to use 2. We can fix that by going up to the gear icon here and changing soft tabs from 4 to 2. And that's it. Now we're ready to go. In this section, we're going to install Rails. Let's move things around a little bit before installing it. I'm going to move this up a little bit, close this down, close this. And now there's one little bit of configuration to set up before installing Rails. Rails, like a lot of Ruby software, is distributed as self-contained packages called gems. Now by default, those gems install a lot of documentation on the local system, in this case the Cloud IDE. But it's usually more convenient to get that documentation online, and most people I know never use the documentation, and yet it's quite time-consuming to install. So we're going to add a little bit of configuration to tell our system not to install that documentation. We'll do this by creating a file called .gemrc. Here I'm using the command line to print out a statement using the echo command. Gem no document, and then this is the append operator, and if the file doesn't already exist, it will just create it. We can inspect it using cat, and there it is. And now we're ready to install Rails. It's very simple because Ruby is already installed on the system, and Ruby automatically comes with the gem package manager. We can install Rails using the gem command. And now we're going to specify the exact version of Rails. Now, you should not necessarily use the version that you see here. You should use the version that's in the text. And this is part of a general principle. If the screencasts ever disagree with the text, you should always go with the text because the text is so much easier to update. So at this point, the most recent version of Rails is 6.0.0. So -v for version. And there we go. Ready to install. Looks like it worked. We can check by doing Rails-V, which will return the version number. And there we go. There's one more bit of configuration, which is to install Yarn, a program to manage software dependencies. The easiest way to do this is to run a command that I've set up on the Learn Enough Content Distribution Network, or CDN. This command is a little advanced, but it should just work if you copy and paste. I'll paste it in here. You can see it goes from cdn.learnenough.com, yarn install. And that's it. The Cloud IDE is now fully configured for Ruby on Rails web development. Our first Rails application is going to be a so-called Hello World program. This follows in a long tradition in computer programming of having the first program be something really simple, traditionally just printing out the string Hello World. This is really useful because it allows us to separate the programming from the system setup. By choosing a really easy example, we can verify that things are basically working before trying to do anything more complicated. We'll be working in this environment directory. And in this directory, we're going to create a new Rails app using Rails new. Now, ordinarily, I would just type Rails new and then the name of the application. But in this case, I'm going to specify the exact version number of Rails so that if you happen to have a slightly different version installed, this command will fail and then will prompt you to install the right version of Rails. This is done to minimize the chances of something going wrong when following the tutorial. So the way to do this is with an underscore, the version number, and then another underscore. So Rails 6.0.0, and again, use the version in the text, not here necessarily. Rails new, and then the name of the application. In this case, we'll call it Hello App. All right, it's all set up. Now, that might take a minute or two, but I think this is working. Let's cd into the directory, change directory Hello App. And we can also see here, look at the file tree, and these are all the files and directories created by Rails new. Now, this was a big deal when Rails first came out. The idea that a web framework would create a bunch of standard files and directories was huge, because it means you're immediately oriented with any application you're looking at. We'll be spending most of this tutorial in the app directory, and also starting in chapter 3 in the test directory. But throughout the course of this tutorial, we'll touch on many of these directories and files and end up with a thorough understanding of the default Rails file and directory structure. The next step is to use a program called Bundler to install all of the gems needed by our application. Now, Rails new automatically runs Bundler, and it installs all the gems specified in the so-called gem file. This line here tells Bundler that we want to use Rails 6.0.0, or because of this little tilde greater than sign, if 6.0.1 is available, or 6.0.2, or something like that, then Bundler will install that automatically. But it won't install something like 6.1 or 6.2. This is a way of making it safer to install and update gems. Experience shows, though, that in fact it's a good idea to use exact version numbers. This is the best way to get a consistent experience and minimize the chances of errors. So what we're going to use is a gem file that specifies exact version numbers and is available in a place where it's easier for me to update in case something changes. If you're using an online version of the book, it should be synchronized automatically. But if you're following the book in a PDF, EPUB, or MOBI, there might be some discrepancies. You should always use the one that's available online at gemfiles 6th edition.railstutorial.org. That version will always be fully up to date. Look here, initial gem file. Click on raw, copy it. And there we go. And now I'll install the gems with these exact version numbers using bundle install. This is exactly the sort of thing that might happen. It looks like Selenium WebDriver here has been updated since I made this gem file. This is a chance to apply technical sophistication. How do we fix this? It says, try running bundle update Selenium WebDriver. That's the name of the gem. It's a little out of date. So there, the error message actually told us the exact thing we had to do. And now it should be working. And just for future reference, I'm going to change this from 142.3 to 142.4. By the way, there's a shortcut or alias for bundle install. It's just bundle. All right, we're ready to go. The next step is to get a local Rails server running. We're going to run a web server right in the Cloud IDE. I like to do this in a new terminal tab. I use the main terminal for executing commands, and then use a new one for running the server because the server actually takes over the tab. So here we go, new terminal, cd hello app, and then Rails server. Now the way to look at it on the Cloud IDE is to go to Preview and then Preview Running Application. You can spawn it into a new window here. Now you can see that we've got an error. Now I showed this to you intentionally because this is the error I ran into when I updated the tutorial to Rails 6. So what did I do? I applied my technical sophistication. In this case, I did some Google searches. I don't remember the exact things. It was probably something like Cloud9, blocked host, Ruby on Rails. The solution I found involves clearing the so-called hosts in the local development environment. Now the truth is, I don't actually 100% understand how this works, but I tried it and it does. The file we need to edit is in the configuration directory, or config, environments, development.rb. So here we'll say this is a comment character, not crucial to understand. We'll be covering this later in the tutorial. But this is a comment saying, let's allow connections to local server. And this is the command I found, config.host.clear. Let's use Control-C. You can see Control-C to stop. We'll use Control-C to stop it, up arrow, Rails server, and see if it works. And there we go. Yay, you're on Rails. This isn't quite Hello World yet, but we've taken a big step in that direction. At this point, we're almost ready to make our Hello World app. But before we do, even at this early stage, I'd like to introduce the notion of a model view controller architecture. This is the pattern that Rails and many other web frameworks follow for structuring web applications. If we look in the app directory, we see models, views, and controllers. These are the three main components of the web application as visualized here. Now the way that Model View Controller, or MVC, works is that a browser, in this case represented using the Firefox icon, sends a request to a web server running our application, which then sends the request to the controller. So the controller kind of sits in the middle and coordinates the different parts of the app. Generally speaking, it will talk to the model, which then talks to the database. The model will return some information to the controller, which then calls the view, which gets converted to HTML and is then returned by the controller to the browser, which renders the HTML as a web page. This may seem a little abstract at this point, but don't worry, we'll be covering this thoroughly at increasing levels of sophistication throughout the rest of this tutorial. All right, we're finally ready for Hello World. We just saw model view controller. We're not going to use the model at all, and we're going to fake a view in the controller itself. We'll see our first example of the full MVC architecture in the next chapter. This here is the main and currently only controller, the application controller. And now we're going to define a Ruby function called hello, which I can make using def tab. It's called a tab trigger, supported by lots of different text editors. Def hello, that defines hello. And now in the context of MVC, this is what's called an action. Actions live inside of controllers. So this is the hello action. And now I'm going to render just a little bit of text as HTML. Just the simple string, hello world. Conventionally all lowercase for historical reasons. You can save that. Let's take a look at our application. So this is still the default. Yay, you're on Rails. There's just one thing left to do, which is to configure our application to route the main URL, that home page that we just visited, to this action. And the way to do that is in config/routes. You can see there's a comment here indicating that there's a Rails guide on routing. Get rid of that for now. Now the syntax for this is to define the so-called root route. This is the root of our application. In Rails, this is just the word root, and then we say the name of the controller, in this case, application, because it's the application controller right here. And then this hash symbol and the name of the action, which is just hello. Save that. Refresh this. And there we go. Hello world. So at this point, we've successfully made a working web application to display the string hello world. It may not seem like much, but this is a huge step forward. Now that we have a working hello world application, it's time to take a step that I consider to be practically essential, namely putting our project under version control. Version control is a category of application that's used to track changes in projects. This means that we have a backup of all our code and all the changes we've made, and it also makes it easier to recover from errors and to collaborate with others. There are quite a few different version control systems out there, but the software development community has largely standardized on Git, a distributed version control system originally developed by Linus Torvalds to host the Linux kernel, which among other things we're using right here in the Cloud IDE. Git's a pretty large subject, and we'll be restricting our coverage to the commands needed to complete this tutorial. For a more thorough introduction to the basics of version control with Git, I recommend taking a look at Learn Enough Git to be dangerous. One other surprising effect of using Git for version control is that it will make deployment really easy, as we'll see in the next section. If you're using a native development system, at this point you might have to install Git, and you should refer to the text for a link. But it's already included here in the Cloud IDE. We can use the which command to find out where it is, which git. So this shows us that it exists. You can say git -v. I think actually this won't work. Yeah, unknown option -- version will work. Now your results here may vary. The exact version number isn't that important. But we see that Git is in fact installed on this system. Before using Git for our project, there's some one-time system setup that we have to do. So first we're going to configure the name and email address associated with our Git changes, called commits. The way to do this is with the git config command. This is a global change, and we're going to say user.name. In this case, it'll be me. And then the same thing, I can do up arrow, user.email, and then here I'll do my main email address. Oh, now interestingly, I just realized I used quotes here. And I'm not sure if that's exactly the same. So let's take a look at this. I'll use the less command to take a look at the git config. Is this it? Yeah, here we go. So that did work. You can actually omit the quote marks there around the email address, but it worked just fine. So you can see here, this is actually where Git keeps its configuration. It's a little file in the home directory, tilde, called .gitconfig. So it's hidden. That dot means it's a hidden file in Unix. So that's set up. And now actually we can see this here. You can see the editor here is user bin nano. So nano is a very simple editor. It's not a very powerful editor, but it's really easy to use. So we'll adopt it as our default. Let's set it up. So you can see which nano. Notice that this disagrees. This says user bin nano, and this says /bin/nano, bin nano. I'm not sure why that's the case, and this might have changed by the time you're watching this. But in order to get things to work, we actually have to set up what's called a symbolic link between where Git thinks nano is and where it actually is. Now, the way to make a symbolic link is with the ln command, link, and then -s for symbolic. I want to overwrite it if it exists, so I'm going to say F for force, although it should work either way. And then I can actually, in this command, have which nano in backticks. This is not important to understand, but this is just a nice little technique. We just saw what which nano was. Which nano is bin nano. So this is going to link /bin/nano to the actual place where we want it. We're going to link it into the user bin directory. This is where Git thinks it is. Now this won't work. It's going to say permission denied. So this is an important trick to know. This is sudo. This says do it as the super user. It's actually technically substitute user do, but the default substitute user is the super user, also known as root, which can do anything on the system, including write which nano to this directory. So now if we do which nano, user bin nano. If we do ls-l, that's the long form of listing. We can see that it's actually a link to /bin/nano. I'm including these as a special bonus for the screencasts, but these are not details that are particularly important to know for Ruby on Rails web development. All right, the next step is to make one more configuration. It's optional, but it's really convenient. One of the things that Git is really good at doing is making branches, kind of like branches on a tree, where you can have a separate line of development that can then get merged back into the main trunk of the code. We'll see how to do this later in this section. Now the command to switch to a branch is called git checkout. And that's a lot to type, so it's very common to set up what's called an alias, just a shortcut, so that you can type git co instead of git checkout. In this tutorial, I'll mainly type git checkout just for maximum compatibility, but this configuration is so common that you will often encounter people typing git co, and it's important to know how they set that up. There's one final bit of configuration, which is to set Git to remember any passwords we type in. As we'll see later in this section, we're going to be storing our source code on a remote server, and it's nice not to have to type our password in every time we want to access that code. The way to do this is with a global configuration for credential.helper. We'll set a cache with a timeout of 86,400 seconds, which is 1 day. So that's the end of the one-time setup. Now we're going to do some setup for this repository specifically. We're already there. I can print working directory, pwd. You can see here we are, hello app. This prompt also has hello app, right here. And it's actually configured to show what's called the master branch. This is very convenient. Most systems don't come pre-configured like this, so if you're on a native system, you might not see this. This little detail is covered in Learn Enough Git to be dangerous. The first step is to set up our project as a Git repository with git init. That's to initialize the repository. You can see here that Git stores everything that it does in a special directory called .git. It's a hidden directory, as indicated by the dot. We don't see it here, but ls-a list all does show it. And now we're going to add all of the files in our project. We'll do git add -A. Some people do git add dot, where dot indicates the current directory, and that's not quite the same thing. And in the rare cases where they differ, this is actually the one you want. So I recommend doing git add -A to add everything. And we can see the effect of that with git status. You can see here, we just added a bunch of new files. It says no commits yet. So let's make a commit. This tells Git about our changes. It bundles all of these changes into one package and says we want to make these a single commit to a single set of changes that are all related. We'll give Git a message with -m, and then here let's say initialize repository. We can use git log to see the effect. And there's the commit, initialize repository, and it's identified by a so-called SHA. At this point, our system and our project are fully configured to use Git. Version control is useful for lots of different things. Let me show you one of the most important if things really go wrong. So let's take a look at the controllers directory. App controllers. It's here. Hello app. App controllers. Here it is. For the Hello app, this is most of the application. There's just this in the routes. Let's take a look at the application again. And there we are, hello world. So now, what if we accidentally deleted that entire directory? We can use rm remove -rf -recursive force app controllers. So that's deleted, and close it, and now our application is broken. We can look at the status. So we see that the application controller and the subdirectory, in this case a directory called concerns, have been deleted. At this point though, Git is going to save the day. There are actually at least a couple of different ways to do this, but the command that I can most easily remember is git checkout -f for force. That restored it. App, controllers, now it's back. Git status says nothing to commit. We refresh here, there's an error. This is the sort of thing the server really doesn't like, to have a file just deleted like that. So let's try this. Let's do this. Control C to shut down the server and restart it. This is a good example of technical sophistication, saying, wait a minute, why isn't it working? And then thinking, this is the kind of thing that might have broken the server. So here we go, refresh, and we're back. Hello world. Especially when combined with a remote backup, using Git gives us an incredible peace of mind. Any change that we've recorded, and especially any change we've both recorded and pushed to a remote server, is extremely difficult to lose. I don't think I've ever lost a significant amount of work in any project under version control with Git. Now that we've put our Hello app under version control with Git, it's time to push it up to a remote repository for safekeeping. We'll be using GitHub, a site optimized for hosting and sharing Git repositories. Among other things, as mentioned earlier, GitHub is actually written in Rails. The first step is to go to github.com and sign up for an account if you don't already have one. Then sign in. And then click on this little plus icon to make a new repository. We'll call it Hello app, and then say Hello World app for the Ruby on Rails tutorial. Now, technically speaking, Rails apps are safe to just put up on the web for anyone to see, but that's a dangerous practice. It's so easy to leak some sort of authentication key or password. So I think it's a good practice by default to make all web applications private, like this. One of the cool things about GitHub is that you can have as many public and private repositories as you want. You only have to pay them if you want to collaborate on private repos. Create it there. And now this is the page that we get after creating the new repository with instructions on how to set up our local system. And by local here, I mean the Cloud IDE. There are two options here. There's HTTPS, Secure Hypertext Transfer Protocol, or SSH, Secure Shell. Now, there are real advantages to using SSH, including the ability to remember passwords indefinitely. But it's a little bit more difficult to get it to work. You have to configure things called SSH keys. If you're comfortable with that, or if you're up for a challenge, you're welcome to go that route. But for simplicity, we're going to do HTTPS. And then we can just go down here, and this here is just a little clipboard. You can click it, and it actually puts it on the pasteboard buffer. It's equivalent to copying this text. And I'll paste it in here. So this adds GitHub as what's called the remote origin, and then we push -u is what's called upstream. Not important at this level, but there's a link in the text if you want to click on it and read more about it. Here I have to put in my username and the password this time, but remember we set it up to remember the password for today. Looks good. Let's refresh it. And there we go. That's our initial repository. You can see here's a README that was generated by Rails. It has a little information. At this point, we have only one commit, but you can already see that all of our files are here. App, controllers, application controller. And as we make changes, GitHub lets us visualize those changes from commit to commit. We'll see an example of that in the next section. In the last section, we pushed our application up to GitHub, and you might have noticed that GitHub rendered this README file quite nicely as HTML. Let's take a look at that here. Now it's tempting to click on this README, but this is the Cloud9 README. What we want is this here, the README generated by Rails. Now if you look at this file, you might recognize it. This is a format known as Markdown, thus the .md. And this is a convenient human-readable format that's easy to convert to HTML for display on the web. We're going to do it using a technique called branching, which I wouldn't ordinarily use for this small a change. But just as using Hello World as a very simple program in order to get everything else working, here we're going to make a very simple change in order to learn the mechanics of branching and then merging back into the master branch. Let's get started by checking out a new branch. Remember, I could do git co here because of the alias, but for completeness, I'll type git checkout -b for branch, and then I'll put in the branch name. Let's say modify readme. Let's look at the branches with git branch. Now you can think of a branch as essentially a copy of our project, where any changes are made independently of any other branches. As you might guess, Git is smarter than that, and it doesn't make a full copy of everything. But this is really convenient for making changes in a self-contained way, so that if we did something really horrible, we could just not merge it back into master. All right, let's improve the README here. The hash symbol there is a top level heading, and then we can make a second level heading like this. Hello world. So here asterisks sets the text as italics, and the brackets indicate that I'm going to make this a link like this. So the brackets are the text, and then in parentheses, I can put the link. Now you might have noticed here that it's spilling across here. I'd like to wrap this text for convenience. Maybe view wrap lines. Yeah, there we go. Let's put this here. Make a link. My website at michaelhartl.com, and then have a friendly greeting. Hello world. Let's check the status. All right, we've got a modification. We can also look at the difference with git diff. It's mostly deleting things, as you might expect. It says here no new line at end of file. It's actually a good practice to include that. A lot of editors include it automatically. This is nice for several reasons. If you just cat it with the cat command, it's covered in Learn Enough command line. You can see here at the end, we have hello world and then the prompt right away. That's not very nice, and so it's a good practice to include a new line here. So here we go. There we go. All right, this is ready to be committed. Before we did git add -A, but here we haven't actually added any files, so we don't have to do that. We can do this, git commit -A, meaning all of the current changes, then -M for message, improve the README file. And in fact, you can combine these two, git commit -AM, which is what I would usually type. So we've made our changes on the modify README branch. Now let's go back to master. And you can see that the README reverts. That's because we made the change only on the other branch. So to get that change into the master branch, we can use the git merge command. The Cloud IDE system is configured to let you do a tab here. That tab completion is really useful, especially when you have longer branch names. Learning how to configure a native system with tab completion is covered in Learn Enough Git to be dangerous. Okay, let's do the merge. And there it is. Now the change has been incorporated into the master branch, which is Git's default. Let's do git branch again. You can see that modify README is still there. There's an asterisk indicating that master is the branch we're currently on. And as you might have noticed here, modify README, master. I noted that before. This is a nice piece of configuration. It lets us know right in the prompt which branch we're on. It's a good practice when you're not going to use a branch for anything else to delete it. And we can do that with git branch -D for delete. This lowercase d will delete the branch only if it's safe to do so. In other words, only if it's been merged into master. So let's do this, mo tab, and that worked. Now, if you wanted to delete a branch no matter what, just say to git really delete this no matter what's going on, it's just -D. As a final step, let's push it up to GitHub. Now before there was a longer command, it was git push -u origin master. But that set up the configuration such that for subsequent pushes, we only have to type git push. Let's refresh here. And there we are. As promised, GitHub has converted the markdown into HTML with a top level heading, a second level heading, and a couple of links. We can also see here, readme.md, here's the new readme, but we can also look at the history. This is the initial commit, and then this is our change, like that. As mentioned, using Git for version control gives us a way of recovering from errors, of backing up our project, of collaborating with others, and as we're about to see, deploying our application to production. In this section, believe it or not, we're actually going to deploy our Hello app to the live web. This is sometimes called deploying to production, and it used to be really hard. Back in the early days of Rails, deployment was incredibly challenging. But nowadays, it's amazingly easy, especially if you use a service called Heroku. I've actually been using Heroku since the very beginning. Heroku was part of an entrepreneur program called Y Combinator, and I went through Y Combinator at the same time. Partially as a result of that, the Rails tutorial has been using Heroku since the first edition, way back in 2010. Heroku is an amazing service, and I'm excited to show you how it works. Before deploying to Heroku, we need to add a little configuration. We'll start with the gem file. We can see here that the SQLite 3 gem is in the development and test environment, but not in production. This is a database adapter gem that is not supported at Heroku, so it's really important that this be inside of this group environment. And then what we'll do is add the database that Heroku does use, which is necessary even though the Hello app doesn't use a database. And this is in the production group. This syntax, by the way, is explained later in the tutorial, as you might imagine. It's not important to understand it now. This is the PG gem for PostgreSQL, also called Postgres for short. So this is how you put in the gem, but remember that I mentioned that you should always use the version online. And that's this version here, the final gem file for this chapter. You can copy it like this if you want, but it's easier just to go to raw, select all, copy, and paste. By the way, you can see that it actually moved. I put it below this. For some reason, I'd like to put it here usually. This is very Windows specific down here, but the ordering doesn't actually matter. So let's save that. And now this is an important command. We're going to bundle install again, but we're going to install without production. In fact, we can do bundle install. Let's check it out. Right, and so we see that there's an error. This is because Postgres is not supported on the Cloud IDE. But we can do this. -- without production. And there we go. That didn't actually add any gems because the only gem we added here is only in the production environment. But it did update the lock file, which is needed by Heroku. Let's commit it. And now we need to create the remote application using the Heroku command. In order to get this command to work, you'll first have to sign up for a Heroku account at Heroku.com. And once you've done that, you'll be ready to run the Heroku command, which, as you can see, is not currently installed on the Cloud IDE. Heroku has documentation for how to install it on various systems. For this particular system, I've put together the commands needed to install Heroku using the same basic technique we used to install Yarn earlier on in this chapter. I just copied the command from the tutorial, and here it is. Now which Heroku is working? We can say Heroku -- version, and there we go. As usual, the exact version numbers may differ. At this point, we're almost ready to create the application. We just need to log in first like this. Now by default, Heroku login tries to spawn a new browser, which won't work on the Cloud IDE. So here I'm going to say -- interactive. Now that we're logged in, we can create the remote application using Heroku create. Here's the URL. So there's nothing there yet. It's just a blank application. But at this point, we're ready to deploy. All we need to do is push our repository up to Heroku, and Heroku will take care of the rest. By the way, you might have noticed that there are some warning messages. Those are safe to ignore for now. We'll be addressing them in a later chapter. Let's take a look. Let's refresh our app. Hello world, in production. You can see here, this URL is actually on the web. Yours, of course, will differ, but it's a subdomain at herokuapp.com. This is really a remarkable accomplishment. Even though it's a very simple application, it's on the live web. This is the kind of thing that in the early days of web application development was practically impossible to do. But here we've done it in the first chapter. Heroku supports a bunch of different commands. In this section, we'll take a look at just two of them. So first of all, there's Heroku logs. This is a really useful command for debugging, because it shows us what's going on in our application. An especially useful variation is this, Heroku logs -- tail, which just waits, and if we do this, refresh, you can see that it's updating. A second useful command is Heroku rename. This changes the name from this default here to something of our choosing. But it's what's called a global namespace. It's something.herokuapp.com, so it has to be unique, which is a minor restriction. In particular, you won't be able to use this exact one. So I predict this will fail. Yes, it's already taken. It's taken by me in the last edition. So let's do Rails tutorial hello -6 for Rails 6 or 6th edition. There we go. Boom! Hello world. As you might imagine, since you don't necessarily want to run your application on something.herokuapp.com, Heroku also supports custom domains. And in fact, both learnenough.com and railstutorial.org run at Heroku. So if you're on the website right now, you are using a Heroku app. To learn how to use custom domains with Heroku, see the link in the text to the Heroku documentation. We've come a long way in this chapter, from the development environment setup, installation and version control, all the way to deployment. In the next chapter, we'll build on this foundation to make a simple but real database-backed web application called Toy App, which will give us our first real taste of what Rails can do.